framework in which the structuring system of conception, the conceptual structuring system of language, had a series of extensive, what I call schematic systems. And I mentioned three. I only dealt with two. One was the configurational structure. Another was the location of perspective point. And the third one was the distribution of attention. And together these form what I sometimes call the architectonic systems. They represent how concepts are structured with respect to space and time in particular. Then there are the ergal systems. And the main one there is force dynamics. So what force dynamics is then a fourth schematic system which structures conception as it's expressed in language with respect to a particular set of concepts. And these concepts are force interactions. I should say at the outset that it's a generalization over the traditional notion of causativity or causation. So, force dynamics includes concepts like an object's having some kind of intrinsic tendency towards action or towards rest, some other object impinging on it and potentially overcoming that object's tendency. This object can, in turn, resist that tendency to overcome it. So we've got all these complex force interactions. In addition, there are notions of blockage and release of blockage. So all these are together in this system of force dynamics. And it turns out to be much richer in conception and in language than has traditionally been recognized. And so there's a whole system there that has been discovered and which has its own logic and organization. So and what it does is it generalizes over causativity. Causativity was previously taken as just like a single unitary concept, a block concept. But in this force dynamic framework, it can be seen instead to consist of a number of different components, and so that you can now set the whole system within a framework of varying components, only certain members of which count as causation. And it places, therefore, causation together with, side by side with concepts like letting, inhibiting, blocking, trying, preventing, all sorts of concepts of that sort, which hadn't previously been thought of in the same vein as causation itself. So that's what this whole enterprise is about. And since it's a novel concept, I can begin by illustrating it. So here's a series of sentences, and force dynamics spans both the physical and the psychological. It applies the same force dynamic patterns. Interactions of forces apply both to the physical objects interacting with each other, and to psychological, and to interpersonal, which is another way of saying social, and to modality. All of this comes under the force dynamic aegis. So just to give some examples, in the physical realm, you could have, and here I'll make pairs of sentences. The first will be force dynamically neutral. It won't represent force dynamics, and the second one will. So one is the ball rolled along the green, or along the lawn, something like that. So here we just have a picture of a ball rolling along the lawn. And you can take a video tape of it. You can video it doing that. Now you can say, You now add force dynamics if you now say the ball kept rolling along the lawn, along the green. And there's two ways that two force dynamic patterns that this could now represent. One is that the ball's natural tendency is towards rest, and that this is being overcome by something stronger outside it, like the wind. So you can say the ball kept rolling along the green because of the wind blowing on it. Or conversely, it could be that the ball's intrinsic tendency is in fact towards motion, and it's being opposed by stiff grass, but the ball rolls anyway, despite the stiff grass. And once again, you would say the ball kept rolling along the green, despite the stiff grass. So by adding in the word keep, you can now still video this event. You'll still see the ball rolling, as you did in the first sentence. But in addition, now conceptually, you've added in an additional complex of concepts, namely of opposing forces. The ball's tendency and something either overcoming it, or the ball overcoming something else. So all this is in the physical realm. The next example would be in the psychological realm. So it's force dynamically neutral is John doesn't go out of the house, go out or leave the house, whatever. And that's, again, you can video this, and you'll simply put a video camera in front of the door, and John never leaves it. In the second case, you say John can't go out of the house. And as soon as you say this, the video camera does the same. So in other words, in terms of actual overt physical events, nothing has changed. But what has changed is your conceptualization of it. Again, I stress that one thing that cognitive linguistics does is it emphasizes the power that language has to impose conceptualizations on the scene, and it can impose different patterns of conceptualization on what would otherwise be the same scene. So, in this case, if you say John can't leave the house, what you have is some kind of an opposition. In this case, John wants to leave the house, so that's a force dynamic tendency, a tendency towards, an intrinsic tendency towards action. And something, whether we don't know what or where, but something typically external to John, but it could be another part of John, opposes this tendency of John's to leave. And furthermore, it's stronger, so its opposition wins and manages to block John from leaving the house. So you now have a force dynamic opposition. The net resultant of this is like a vector. If any of you have ever done vector addition in math or physics, the vector resultant of this is no motion. And the video camera still reports no motion, but this time we now understand it in a different way. It's zero motion as the result of two opposing force actions, one of them stronger than the other. The one preventing it stronger than the one intending it. Okay, you could now have the same kind of force dynamic patterns also occur inside of the psyche of a single individual. And in this case, it involves the concept of the self being divided into two different components. One part that wants one thing and another part that wants another thing. All of these will be elaborated further as we get down into the talk. But I want to convey a sense of how the system works beforehand, so that since it's a novel concept. In this case, an example is he didn't close the door, versus he refrained from closing the door. Now, in both cases, again, you can videotape this, and there's no closing of the door. But in the first case, it's force dynamically neutral. In the second case, there is some portion, he is understood to have two different portions, both within his psyche. One portion wants to close the door. Another portion opposes that. So this portion, let's say, wants to close the door. Another portion that opposes that is stronger and wins, and therefore suppresses the intention to close the door. And so there's a net resultant of no closing the door. And the way you can say that in English is he refrained from closing the door. And it turns out that in psychologically internal force dynamic opposition can also be captured by different lexical items. So you can lexicalize either force dynamic neutrality or force dynamic opposition. So the two words are, in this case, an example of this is polite versus civil. So you can say she is polite whenever he is around, is force dynamically neutral. But she is civil whenever he's around implies a force dynamic opposition. All of this is lexicalized within the word civil. It means some part of her wants to insult him, wants to be rude to him, but an external part of her psyche, another part of the psyche, suppresses that, so the net result is that she ends up being polite to him. So that's civil. It's polite against, through suppression of rudeness. And finally, there's an example of interpersonal force dynamics, which is where, in this case, both of the sentences are force dynamic. One is, she has got to go to the park. So in this case, she doesn't want to, but some external social pressure impinges on her, is stronger, and gets her to go to the park. The other one is, she gets to go to the park. That means she wants to go to the park. I'll put her over here, wanting to go to the park. Her natural tendency is to go. And something which is stronger and could block her from going to the park, some authority, is out of the way. I represent that in the diagrams that follow by some being vertically out of the way. So she is able to go to the park. The potential authority that could block it is not bothering to, or just hasn't done so. And so she goes to the park, manifesting her desire to, because the potential blockage is not in place. And that's what it means in English to say she gets to go to the park. So these are two different force dynamic patterns on the same two figures. Let's see, what's that? Okay. So now we go to the base force dynamic. So all of this I'm going to represent with diagrams, which turn out to be rather orderly. And it's good to work it out and to represent it in diagrams because you can then see, by manipulating the different components of the diagrams, which parts remain to be described to fill out the full matrix, the full framework. And sure enough, the language has forms that fill this in. So let's start off with the first part of this is what are the elements that go into these diagrams? And there are basically four kinds of elements. One is I've been showing with my hands something that wants to move or doesn't want to move and something opposing it with my cupped hand. So the fist will be represented by a circle that I call the agonist, and the cupped hand that can impose on it will be represented by a concave structure that I call the antagonist. And these terms are taken from physiology, from anatomy of opposing muscle pairs. So this muscle, the bicep, is the agonist, and something which opposes it is the antagonist. And muscle pairs are typically joined in this way to get the motions moving. So that's where I borrowed the terms from, and I think they're quite appropriate for this force realm, this domain of force. So those are the two main elements in there. And the agonist is the one whose fate our interest lies in. That is where our attention is at. Will the agonist get to manifest its tendency or not? So the agonist has two possible tendencies. One is a tendency towards rest, an intrinsic tendency towards rest, which I represent with a solid dot inside the circle, or a tendency towards action of some sort. It could be motion, it could be any kind of action, which I represent with an arrowhead inside the circle of the agonist. So the agonist is the circle. Then there is what's it next? The resultant. What results from this interaction? That I show in a line below the agonist. After all, our interest, our concern is whether the agonist gets to manifest its intrinsic tendency or if that's thwarted. So the resultant of this interaction between the two force elements is indicated by a line below the circle, and what actually gets realized is shown if the realization is rest, then there's a big solid dot there, and if the realization is in fact motion, then there's an arrowhead there. And finally, which of the two force entities is stronger? And I put a plus sign in that. So with these, and I don't bother to put a minus sign in the other because it's automatic, unless I need to represent color constructions. So, okay, with these, we can now represent with diagrams the four basic force dynamic tendencies that are steady state. There are steady state force interactions that maintain their constancy. There are ones which shift, and I'll get to the shifting ones next. So in the force dynamic steady state ones, there are really four basic ones. One is, they're all, in all four ones, the antagonist is in impingement with the agonist. So in the first, in the upper left character of the diagram is the case where the agonist, the circle, is stronger, so it gets to manifest its intention, its tendency. In this case, its tendency is towards. Wait, let me see if I got that right. No, I got that wrong. No, sorry. In the upper left one, it's the agonist which is stronger. So it overcomes the tendency, whatever the tendency is of the circle. In the upper left one, the tendency of the circle is to be at rest. It just wants to sit there. But something comes along, impinges on it, which is stronger, and forces it to move. So the net resultant of it is some kind of motion. So you see that on the line beneath that is an arrowhead. An example of this is the ball rolled along because of the wind. Okay, the ball kept rolling because of the wind blowing on it. So the ball in this case represents the agonist. The kept is in there showing the force dynamic presence. And the wind is going to be the antagonist. And in this case, the ball wouldn't roll if it weren't for the wind. So this is an example of extended causing of action. So it's extended means it's steady state. It keeps on going. And it's extended causing. It's causing because the antagonist doesn't want to. It's overcome by something stronger, so it does it. It's caused to move. So that's extended causing of action. I might as well pair this with the one on the bottom right one, which is also causing. That's extended causing of rest. In this case, the agonist wants to move, but something stronger is blocking it. So the agonist in this first diagonal, the antagonist is stronger. It's got the plus sign in it, so it overcomes whatever the natural tendency is in the agonist. In this case, it blocks it. It forces it to rest. And an example of this is the logs kept lying on the ridge, on the incline because of the ridge there. Is that right? It's that's extended causation of rest. The example sentences that go with these diagrams are beneath them. And the A goes with the A diagram, the B sentence goes with the B diagram, and so forth. Okay, so those are both, that diagonal, I'll do it as facing you, from top left to bottom right, is the stronger antagonist. The plus sign is in the antagonist. So it overcomes the intrinsic tendency of the agonist. It either forces it to move or it forces it to stay put, even though it wants to move. So the logs on the incline, they want to move, they want to roll down the incline, but there's a ridge there that's preventing them from rolling, so it's blocking them. Okay, now let me go to the other incline. Starting at the top right, we've now got, what's stronger now is the agonist. The circle is stronger. It's got the plus in it. So it gets to manifest its natural tendency. But it's merely opposed, but it's ineffectual opposition. This is the first of the despite types. This other diagonal, I'll face you, going from this diagonal, from top right to bottom left, represents the concept of despite or although. So the sentence that goes with this top right one is, the shed kept standing despite the gale wind, it's a very strong wind, despite the gale wind blowing on it. So here is the shed. Its natural tendency is to stay in place. And in fact, it manages to do so despite the powerful wind blowing on it. The wind blows and blows, but it can't knock it over. So it maintains its natural tendency. By the way, when I say this, I'm phrasing it like the shed wants to stay put, its natural tendency, it overcomes. All these words are how we conceptualize it. It's a conceptual pattern imposed on these actual objects. The actual objects are following physics, whatever the minute physical interactions are with gravity and friction and everything else. That's not the issue. The issue is that we conceptualize there being a shed as one object, the wind as a second object, and they're pushing on each other. That's the realm in which I am dealing. It's the realm of conceptualization as it is represented in language. Okay, so this is an example of despite. The shed keeps standing despite the gale wind on it. Now we're going down to the other despite here, down the slant line, down to, if I face you, it's the bottom left, that should be over here for you. And the example is, the ball kept rolling despite the stiff grass. We've seen this example already. Here, the agonist's tendency is towards motion, and it gets to manifest its tendency despite the stiff grass. The stiff grass tries to oppose it, but fails. The ball moves anyway. So here we've got attempted inhibition. So the bottom two, in fact, there are words in English for what those patterns, those force relationships are. The stiff grass is hindering the ball or impeding the ball. So that it means it's an ineffective attempt, in quotes, to counteract the ball's natural tendency to roll. It's this way. It's an ineffective attempt. So therefore, this is called hindering. But in the bottom case, where the ridge blocks the logs, that's blockage. So that you can say the ridge blocks the logs from rolling down. And in fact, as a further extension of the force dynamic pattern, the sentence I have there is the ridge keeps the balls keeps the log lying in place, keeps the log lying on the incline. That's representing what you name overtly in the sentence is the resultant tendency, the big dot on the line. so you say the ridge keeps the ball lying on the incline. But there are other kinds of sentences that let you name in the sentence the ball's tendency. The log wants to roll down the incline. Then you could say the ridge prevents the ball from rolling down the incline. Now you have a sentence with prevent that then names the intrinsic tendency of the log, which is this pointed arrow. So we have side-by-side sentences which either name the tendency or name the resultant. So what we've got then is we've got this first slant, diagonal line, for you, top left to bottom right, represents extended causation. It represents causation. So that in particular, it represents extended causation. The other diagonal represents the concept of despite. In fact, it's definitional of the concept of despite or anyway or although. That situation. And in fact, we can capture together what is involved in causation here. In all the causative cases here, and we'll find two more causative cases below, the antagonist has to be stronger than the agonist, and it has to differ from it, so that the agonist's, the circle's resultant is different from its own natural tendency, its own intrinsic tendency. That's what happens in causation. It's forced to do what it doesn't want to do. And if it weren't for this stronger antagonist, it wouldn't do it. So whereas with the despite case, the natural tendency of the agonist would happen anyway, with or without the weaker antagonist, and it would also manifest this tendency whether the antagonist is there or not. Okay, so that's, I think, I've pretty well covered the basic ones, right? Okay. So the next one is the shifting ones. In the shifting ones, I'm only going to consider the cases where there's the stronger antagonist. So that means the diagonal from your top left to bottom right, where the antagonist has the plus in it. Okay. Now let's take the basic case. The basic case has the antagonist, the stronger antagonist, in impingement with the agonist, forcing it to do its bidding. If we consider the impingement notions, there are four possibilities. Either the impingement is already present, is constant, or the impingement it comes into impingement with it from not being an impingement, or it was an impingement and goes out of impingement with it, or it never was an impingement with it. Those are the four. We're going to look at those next. The first two, coming into impingement and leaving impingement, those are the shifting types. So the first case is where you've got the top left case, where the agonist is stronger, and the antagonist is stronger. It forces the agonist to move. Okay, we're going to take the case now where the agonist is just sitting there, wanting to sit there, minding its own business. It wants to sit there, and it does sit there. And all of a sudden, some stronger antagonist comes into impingement with it and overcomes its tendency and forces it to move. So now it's really a temporal sequence, before and after. Before the stronger antagonist is in place and after it's in place. And therefore, I made the line underneath show some kind of switch in time. The slant, left of the slant and right of the slant. Left of the slant, the agonist is happy, just sitting there, it stays put. After the slant, it's forced to move with that arrowhead. So an example of that is the balls hitting the lamp made it topple from the table. That, again, you have the example sentences beneath the force dynamic diagrams. So here, it's the balls hitting it made the lamp topple from the table. And beforehand, the lamp was just sitting there on the table, happy, wanting to stay put, and its tendency is towards rest. It manages to manifest its rest. All of a sudden, the ball comes over, unasked for, hits the lamp. In fact, it's stronger. It overcomes the lamp's tendency, and the lamp moves. This is what I call onset causation of motion. So before we had extended causation of motion, the wind kept the ball in motion. If it had stopped, the ball would stop. This is onset causation of motion. It wasn't there before, all of a sudden it's there. This is prototypical causation. If anybody in linguistics has ever talked about causation, that's the one they meant. That's the prototype of causation. I have 3 other types. There are 4 types of causation. And in fact, the very next one is going to be onset causation of rest, which nobody talked about. So in fact, for example, Shibatani talked about causation. He called this ballistic causation. The very word ballistic implies there's no room in his theoretical matrix to consider onset causation of rest, which is where something is moving along, it wants to move along, it's happy moving along, its tendencies to move, and all of a sudden something that's overpowering stops it. So that's going to be stopping. And I think the sentences I have is the waters dripping on it made the fire go out. It's not a great example, but anyway, that's what I have. And there's the natural tendency of the agonist to continue in its way, and there's the thing that overcomes it that makes it stop. Okay, that's, again, represented by the thing coming into place with this arrow showing it coming into place. So that's onset causation of rest. So we have 4, so now we have all 4 causative types. The first 2 from the steady state, so it's extended causation of motion, or extended causation of action, extended causation of rest. It wanted to move, but it was forced to stay still. Now we have onset causation of motion and onset causation of rest. Okay, the next 2, so all those involve different kinds of impingement. In the extended causation case, impingement was simply present. It was already in impingement. In this case, it comes into impingement with. Okay, so causation is defined by positive impingement, either already present or coming into impingement. But there has to be, it's either contact or coming into contact. So causation is defined by that, and where there's a stronger antagonist, and in all cases, the antagonist overcomes the natural tendency of the agonist, whatever that was, whether it was towards action or towards rest. Okay, now we have 2 kinds of negative impingement. The first kind is where something goes out of impingement. It leaves impingement. So here we had like a stronger antagonist that had kept something still, that had wanted to move, its natural tendencies to move, and it blocked it. Now all of a sudden it leaves. That permits this object to manifest its natural tendency and to move. That is already the notion of letting. Letting. L-E-T-T-I-N-G. So the plugs coming loose let the water drain from the tank. So here the plug was in place, and here's the tank of water. There was a plug. The water, in effect, had pressure wanting its tendency. It wanted to move, but it didn't. It couldn't because the hole was blocked. All of a sudden, the plug comes loose, and now the water can move. So you can say the plugs coming loose let the water drain from the tank. So that's onset letting. It's onset letting. because it's a shifting case. It previously was blocking, then it lets you. So it was so it's onset letting of action, and then of course you have onset letting of rest. Everything is perfectly symmetrical. So onset letting of rest is something like the stirring rod's breaking, let the ingredients settle to the bottom. Well, here we have a vat. Here we have a stirring rod, and you keep stirring it, and the solid ingredients, it keeps them in suspension. Keep stirring, the solid ingredients keep whirling around in suspension. The stirring rod breaks, so you can't stir anymore. All of a sudden, the ingredients, which were in suspension, which had they had a natural tendency to drop to the ground and had been kept in suspension by the action of the stirring rod, that stops, and they settle to the ground. They manifest their tendency towards rest. So this is onset letting of rest. It lets them, it doesn't make them. It's not causation. It doesn't make the ingredients go to the ground. On the contrary, it permits the natural tendency of the ingredients, which is towards rest, to manifest itself. It lets it. It removes the overcoming of its own natural tendency. So that's the difference between letting and causing. It permits the natural tendency by going away. So that's the first of two types of letting. And finally, we have the secondary steady state, which is where the stronger antagonist, remember there were four things the stronger antagonist could do. It could, in the first case, it could already be an impingement, that's the steady state type. Then it could come into impingement, then it could leave impingement, and then it could have been out of impingement the whole time. It was away from impingement. And I consider that the two negative impingements types together. And that's also expressed by the word let in English. So in this case, something like water, the example would be the plugs staying loose, let the water drain from the... So in other words, here's the water. It had wanted to go out, to move all along. That's its natural tendency. There was something that stronger that could have overcome it, that could have blocked it, but never did. So the water manifested its tendency. It's a derived force dynamic concept. You'd never think of it if it weren't based on the case of blockage. So it's a possibility of blockage without its actually ever happening. So, and it's still represented by let in English. So you get the plugs being loose or staying loose, let the water drain the tank. And again, we have, in a symmetric way, so that would be extended letting of action, and then you have extended letting of rest. So, I have to set up the example. Let's say there were, there was a wind tunnel, like for airplane testing, and giant fans that make the wind move. And if the fans, so the basic tendency of the air is to be still. But that's overcome if the fans keep moving. If the fans keep moving, the air moves. Well, the fans break. All of a sudden, the fact that they're being broken, they stay broken, they are broken, the air stays in place. Well, then you could say the fans being broken, and now you use the English word let. Let the air stand still in the tunnel. So we're going by English. English, it's not me, it's English that chooses to use the word let there. I didn't tell it to. We go look, English uses the word let there. Well, why is that word let being used in that situation and all the other cases that I gave for letting? Well, there's something in common with that use which English captures by this use of the word let. Namely, that some agonist is allowed to realize, to manifest its intrinsic tendency, either because something that could have prevented it didn't bother to, or because something that could have prevented it, that was preventing it, left its prevention. And all those four cases are captured by the English word let. So in other words, there's, however arcane and Byzantine my analysis may be, it's English that's doing it. So I'm simply finding out what is the underlying conceptualization that governs the use of words in English. Okay, so we've got the basic kinds of physical force dynamic patterns with this. So just a little bit more in this basic section. This is all, I've kept this all physical, and everything here will, extend as well to the psychological realm and the interpersonal realm. So, in all of these four cases, it was a stronger antagonist that could or did prevent some agonist's tendency. Now, however, remember that we had at the outset, in the four basic steady-state cases, there were two of the patterns where the antagonist was in fact weaker. Those were the despite cases. Well, there are more of those. We can do the same thing with them, with the weaker antagonists, that we did with the stronger antagonists. In the original diagrams, they were already in place. So they were so weaker antagonists being moved back. Well, you can also have them go out of place, or come into place, or never have been in place. Same exact situation. So you have the same parallel set. However, it turns out that English in particular, and language in general, is much less endowed with lexicalizations that distinguish all of these patterns. They are very rich in lexicalizations that distinguish the patterns I just went through. But they're less rich. In these patterns, they often don't have any special way of saying them. So I've picked out four that of the weaker antagonist cases that in fact do have ready lexicalization in English. We already saw two of them, namely the despite cases, one of them being hindered. So you can say, we'll do the hinder one. Was it mounds of earth hindered the logs from in rolling down the incline, something like that. These are terrible sentences, but they're still okay. Or benches hinder the children in crossing the schoolyard. Okay. Now, there's the word help in English, one of its uses, in fact, refers to the case where a weaker antagonist leaves impingement. So you can say, smoothing out the earth helped, instead of hindered, helped the logs in rolling down the incline. Or removing the benches helped the kids cross the schoolyard. It's one of the means of help, but it is one. And it, in fact, represents the removal of a weaker antagonist. And the third one that has easy lexicalization in English is leave alone. So that's where the weaker antagonist never came in. So, okay, the teachers left the children alone in their exit from the schoolyard. They could have come in and been a hindrance, an impedance to the children, but they left them alone in their progress. So it's just to fill out the pattern, we've got weaker antagonists not being there at all. Some hindrance not being present. And it turns out there's a way to describe that. And it's lexicalized in English as leave alone. It's significant, by the way, that the word help shows up in this second case, because help is a very special word in English. It's the only regular verb that lets you take another verb after without a to. I mean, apart from a perception verb. So you can say, I helped him push the car up the hill. Or simply, I helped push the car up the hill. It's the only verb in English where you don't have to have a to. You don't say, I helped him to push. There's no to. So, and that property, it shares with modals. And we'll see at the end that modals is a category of English which works very much in terms of force dynamics. And modals also don't take a to. You say, you don't say I must to go, you just say I must go. There's no to there. So the fact that help lacks a to may be an indication that English sees help as an example of force dynamics. It combines them with the modals in the case of what I call a greater force dynamic. Help, make, let, and have all skip a to. So anyway, here's kind of like a summary in section 3, is how seeing force dynamics as a framework. After going through all these tortuous examples, you can see that there's a framework that it shows how it generalizes over previous conceptions of causation and what have you. So first of all, it not only treats causation, but it treats letting, which most systems don't do. Secondly, it treats not only the prototypical forms of causing and letting, but also the non-prototypical ones. So if you look back in all the old works on causing, you'll see that causing was treated either in its most prototypical case, which I call onset causing of motion. Some did a bit of extended causing of motion, but nothing else, nothing of rest. And with letting, if they treated letting at all, it was only the prototype case, namely onset letting of motion. But once you've got this framework, you can fill in all the rest of the cases. In addition, it brings in all the notions of hindering and blocking and trying and all those extra cases, the weaker antagonist cases. It brings in prevention as well as causation. So it's in general by breaking down causation into a series of smaller components, the ones that are in the diagrams, you see that you have a much wider field of concepts of which causation per se is only one corner of this whole framework, of this whole matrix. Okay, so let's see how this whole thing extends to psychological characterization. So it turns out that in the psyche is typically seen, well, first of all, wanting can be treated as a tendency, what I was before referring to as the intrinsic tendency of something, towards rest, towards motion. So wanting can be seen as like an intrinsic tendency, and it can be represented by an arrowhead or by a solid circle of dots. In addition, the psyche is typically understood as having two components, a divided self. And typically they're seen as the part that has the natural tendency is typically seen as more central, and the part that's the antagonist, the part that opposes it, as more peripheral. And in fact, a lot of what shows up as a pattern in the language shows up written large, expanded, theoretized, scientized by forms of early science, in this case by Freudian psychology. So you can almost read Freudian psychology off of the pattern of the sentence, the way the sentence is structured in terms of force dynamics. So let's take a sentence like, I held myself back from responding. Okay, well, I drew the diagram, a set of dashes to form a square to show that this is all contained within a single psyche. And within a single psyche, it's got the two parts. It's got the central part, the agonist, which wants to respond. So it's got an arrowhead. But there's an antagonist which is more peripheral to it, is stronger, and it keeps the psyche from, it keeps the antagonist from responding. So there's a net resultant of no response. And you can equate the peripheral antagonist with the subject of the sentence, I, and the agonist, the central part that wants to respond as the himself, the reflexive direct object. So I held myself back from responding. So it says in open English, it gives you all the parts, all the components of this force dynamic diagram, which is introjected into the structure of the psyche. All of this so conceived. Everything is so conceived. If you can read off the language, something like a folk conceptualization of psychology. It's folk psychology, built into the very fabric of the language. I mean, nobody's saying that this is how anything actually works in the neurons, but this is the folk conceptualization. And in fact, it seems like it's hard to know which came first, but let's say if you assume that the force dynamics started with kind of like a physical interaction of objects, then this was a physicalization of folk concepts of the mind. It analogized mental behavior, folk behavior, or folk concepts of mental behavior to the way physical objects interact, or to the concepts that they already had about how physical objects interact. So, let's see. Okay, so, and in my view, remember I gave at the first lecture a case where I thought that mathematical topology was a theoretized version of something already, a kind of topology already built into the fabric of language, which I described. In the same way, I think Freudian psychology is a theoretized version of a folk model of how the mind works, of the divided self built into the language as well as other cognitive systems. And in particular, what this represents is, for Freud, is the conflict between the id and the superego. So the id is like the unconscious drives, urges, wishes, your real wishes for what you really want to do. That's the agonist with its wants to be rude, wants to respond, whatever it wants. And then the superego is kind of like, is the antagonist, as if it were introjected or internalized from previously external social pressures, which then become a part of the individual's psyche as sort of like, this is how you ought to behave, how you should behave. And it tends to be more in the periphery. So, but you could just read it off of the sentence itself. I held myself back from responding. So, and then of course I show how the refrain example works the same way. It has the same exact structure. I refrain from responding, except in this case you have the sentence pattern, a construction pattern, which doesn't label in distinct forms the components of the force dynamic setup. And so all these were both examples where the innermost self, the agonist, wants to do something. So this is, you could call it a form of suppression, again, or repression if it's unconscious, but suppression if it's conscious. In Freudian terms, which were very force dynamic in character. He had a really force dynamic kind of theory about how the mind worked. His terms could now be applied once we see how force dynamics gets realized in the realm of psychodynamics, psychological behavior, or conceptualizations. So you can now use Freudian terms like repressed, suppressed. It suddenly becomes totally relevant, and those words have perfectly clear realizations in terms of the diagrams that I saw. I think these diagrams they're really fundamental, they're really basic. I think they capture something very fundamental in the way we conceptualize stuff. So then the inverse of this is where is what I call exertion. So that's where the agonist, your innermost self, basically just wants to hang out, sit there in repose, doesn't want to do anything. But some other part of your psyche, presumably more peripheral, and that has gotten internalized from pressures to get going, pushes on it, overcomes it to get into action. So I call this exertion, self-exertion. And so you can have sentences like, he exerted himself in pressing against or pushing against the jammed doorway. So, so like overcoming tendency. So now, in fact, it turns out that the psychological we treat objects differently whether we think of them as being sentient, in other words, having a psyche, versus being inanimate. So consider these two sentences. One is, the new dam resisted the pressure of the water behind it. The other is, the man resisted the pressure of the crowd behind it. Well, in the first one, I think the way we seem to think of it is that the force dynamics is of the first set I gave you. It's purely physical interaction. It's the same. It's one of the original force dynamic diagrams. In this case, the dam is an antagonist that keeps the water in place, and it's stronger, so it resists the pressure of the water behind it. Is that all right? Or do I have this one? Well, it's one or the other. And the point is, we think of it as achieving its qualities due to its own physical rootedness in the ground and its own physical characteristics of strength. But we don't think of this in the case of the man. Maybe I should think of this, the man of the dam as antagonists. We normally think of the man, if the man's psyche weren't there, if the man were unconscious, for example, the man would, as a physical entity, would be a weaker antagonist and would be swept along by the pressure of the crowd. It's only because of the man's psyche, in which he's got this self-exertion kind of internal tendency that overcomes repose, it seems to transfer into the weaker antagonist characters. These are theories that very much incorporate feelings of opposing forces. So it makes perfect sense to use the word dynamics in there. Well, you can have sociodynamics to capture the same kind of thing. And in this case, all of the same, there's this one amazing, I suspect it's universal across all languages. There's this amazing kind of metaphor that seems to exist across all languages, and that extends from physical force dynamics to interpersonal force dynamics. And that's this. In the physical case, you have a real object, you can overcome its resistance. You bite through impingement, through physical impingement. If you don't go far enough, nothing happens. The bottle sits there. You have to go touch it, contact force, then you move it. But what happens with interpersonal sociodynamics? It doesn't work that way. If you force somebody to eat, or force somebody to close his door at night, or something like that, you don't take hold of his arms and make him grab his key and take his fingers and insert into a lock and go like that. You don't do that. That would be contactful physical force dynamics. On the contrary, what you do is you say something to him, you communicate to him, typically in language, but it could be symbolic in some other way. The person, as a language user or as a communication receiver, interprets this message There can be a period of pondering it. Do I want to do this or not? Let's say he experiences some pressure to now go ahead and do this. Well, lock your door tonight. And then goes ahead and does it. Perhaps through a period of a phase of choosing to do so. Well, that whole sequence, which is nothing like the physical, is metaphorically treated as if it were physical, as if it were the exact counterpart of the physical force dynamics. If you did pure physical force dynamics on such a situation, in fact, you wouldn't even use the terms that are otherwise used. You wouldn't say, I persuaded him to, or I have one of my examples is the gang pushed him to, what is it? The gang pushed him to perform certain actions or whatever. Yeah, the gang pushed him to do things he didn't really want to, or let's say whatever. Well, they didn't literally get behind him and push him to do that, like that. If they did, you wouldn't say the gang pushed him to do things. You have to find some other way to phrase it. Once you say push, in fact, you are out of the realm of the physical and in the realm of this communication kind of interface. So now, why this particular rather Byzantine kind of interpersonal interface should apparently universally, show up as accessed by the physical force dynamic metaphor, I don't know. But there's got to be something pretty basic about it. So anyway, you can use all of the same terms as what we saw in the physical case, in the interpersonal case. So you can have sentences like, he finally let her, speak? Is that my example? He finally let her speak? Something like that. Well, he finally let her present her opinion. Well, here, how did he let her? If the plug, I let the water come out of the tank, drain from the tank by pulling the plug out. Well, that's physical. Nothing like that happened in the case of her expressing her opinion. All he did was said, why don't you speak now? Or I'm going to stop talking and you can talk now. Or whatever he did. But he didn't, pull a plug out of her mouth or something like that to let her present her opinion. So it's not physical. So you can apply all these physical force dynamic things to this interpersonal case. In addition, you pick up additional further locutions like push and pressure. The gang pressured him to do things he didn't want to. Okay, so we've got this realm, and it turns out to be a really rich realm. All sorts of lexical items have been lexicalized to refer to this particular realm. It's really extensive. So here's I've got a particular little sequence of events that takes place that can be used as a kind of like a cartoon strip to stand for a certain kind of force dynamic sequence. And it's the same sequence already underlies a lot of physical things, which I didn't include in this handout. It's the same cartoon strip sequence of things, which it underlies expressions like try, like I tried to open the window, I succeeded in opening the window wouldn't budge, things like that are all done this. But we can also use this exact same sequence for interpersonal kinds of pressures. So in this first phase, it has three phases. In the first phase, you've got the same two, agonist and antagonist. In the first phase, the antagonist is weaker. It tries to get the agonist to do something, but it's too strong, it just stays there. In the second phase, somehow they shift their power. Either this gets stronger or this gets weaker or this gets stronger, but all of a sudden a shift in the power balance takes place. In the third phase, then there's a causation where the newly stronger antagonist overcomes the agonist and forces it to do the things that it didn't want to do before and was able to keep from doing. Okay, that's a little sequence of events. Well, if we now show this represented in the realm people acting on each other, trying to persuade and urge and so forth. Well, there are lexical forms in English that represent various parts of this little diagram. For example, there are two which represent the case where your attention is on the first phase and you don't know what happens as an outcome. It's moot. So you could say she urged him to leave. Is that what happened? She urged him to leave. Well, she means she exerted social pressure on him to leave. We don't know if he left or not. All we know is that she exerted pressure on him. And that's the first phase. He's meanwhile stronger, so he's not bothering to leave yet. And now, usually there are paired sentences. We can find sentences which are lexicalized where it takes the antagonist as subject, like this one, or ones which take the agonist as subject. So he was reluctant to leave. Or was it, he was reluctant to leave, or resisted leaving. They're both good. So we've got, means he kept his stronger position. He didn't want to leave, and he kept manifesting his undesire to leave. Then there are cases where we have also lexicalizations which show where in fact, there's an exchange in the balance of power, and in fact, the antagonist prevailed. We'll take that case first. So we're on the third phase, and the antagonist, in fact, prevailed. And then you can say she persuaded him to leave. By saying persuade means there was this prior struggle. You can't just say persuade unless you imply this preceding struggle. She attempted, and finally she won. He gave way. So she persuaded him to leave, represents that third phase in the diagram. And again, we have a counterpart case where he is subject, and then you can say he relented. He relented in leaving, or gave way in leaving. So both of them represent this third phase. I also have cases where, let's say, we're in the third phase. We know what happens, but in fact the outcome was a failure. The antagonist did not get stronger, and so we end with the status quo. Well, that would be in English, in American English, you could say she struck out with him on leaving. So she tried, and then gave up, failed, didn't work. She's subject in this case. And if he's subject, you can say he refused to leave, or he wouldn't leave. Wouldn't means after a lot of social pressure on him, he nevertheless stayed his course, which was associated with President Bush, and wouldn't leave. So, so we find that the same force dynamic diagrams are now applying as well. We experience them, some of these same patterns, in our very stretches of vocabulary. It turns out whole swaths of vocabulary can start falling under this pattern. So let's end with modals. It turns out that the modal system in English is a syntactic category that is rather well defined, and it seems to be semantically dedicated to force dynamics as a whole. So, first of all, let's formally define what a modal is. A modal is this verb-like thing, which, unlike regular verbs, it doesn't take this a to, like so you say you must leave, you don't say you must to leave. It doesn't take an S in the third person, like you don't say he must leave. It doesn't, it takes a not directly after, like he must not leave. You don't say he must leave, as you would with a normal verb. And it permits inversion with the subject, like must he not leave? Things like that. Okay, so these are, and all the verbs I've got there listed in the first couple of lines do this. The ones towards the right, some of them have the ones towards the left have all these traits. As you move towards the right, they start losing a couple of these traits. The honorary modals don't have any of these traits, but they semantically work so much like modals that if you're going to describe English, you can't really ignore them. Okay, let's see, what's the next thing I'm talking about? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I've got a list of them just to show you how I can claim that semantically, as a set, they are in fact force dynamic. I don't have to, but I'm going to use them in a sentence which has the word not in it. So he cannot, leave the house. He must not leave the house. He may not leave the house. He need not leave the house. He dare not leave the house. What have you? If you look at it, semantically, each of these represents a different kind of force dynamic opposition. If you say can't leave the house, it means he wants to leave the house, but we went through this in the introduction. He wants to leave the house, but something is preventing him, and it's stronger than him. Therefore, the net resultant is he's unable to leave the house. He may not leave the house is an opposition between authority. He wants to leave the house. It's his desire to leave the house. But some other person, it's intrinsically interpersonal. Some other person who is an authority figure doesn't want him to leave the house, and that person is more powerful. Therefore, the net resultant is he does not leave the house. And the way you say that is he may not leave the house. But may, in this case, in this usage, is purely interpersonal. He must not leave the house. It's somewhat similar to may not, but it still involves an authority figure. But it's an authority figure that is even more astringent with his means for enforcing his will. He not only says no, he makes sure that the agonist cannot leave the house. We're going to go into detail in a second, but basically it pits the subject's, the speaker's belief system and value system against the observed behavior, the reported behavior of the agonist. I'll go through that in greater detail in a second. Will not leave the house refuses. And it means it's will not or would not. It's his stubborn intentions against other people's wishes about what he would do. Need not is he need not leave the house. Previously, he thought that there was going to be external. It's also interpersonal. It's in the social realm. It's the release from some authority figure, which is more powerful and which was going to force this person to obey. Now has relented, has now changed his mind, and this person need no longer overcome his own lack of desire to do the task. That's need not. He need not leave the house. He didn't want to leave the house. Somebody said, "You've got to leave the house." Then he changed his mind, and John says, "All right, I don't need to leave the house." Next is dare, I guess. And dare is a force dynamic opposition between courage and threat. It's your own courage and threat and an external threat. And when you combine it with not, it means that the external threat is stronger and overcomes your own internal courage. So, like, he dare not leave the house, in fact, means he's too cowardly to leave the house. If he were bolder, he might leave the house. Okay, so that's by way of demonstrating that almost every single modal we have in English has, as one of its core meanings, a force dynamic opposition between opposing forces. So should, as in something like, she should, now, first of all, my first observation is any simple sentence like that, where you've got a single subject, is really a shortened version of something that semantically or conceptually is longer. And in fact, you can typically also say it in a longer way if you want to. Typically, there is some other person other than the subject of the sentence whose opinions are involved. So, for example, if you say, she should lock her doors when she leaves, might typically mean something like, I think that she should lock the doors when she leaves, or either that or you're positing some kind of societal norm that deserves, that exerts some kind of pressure and deserves obedience, something like that. But let's just say it's I. Same with he should spend more time with his children. It's short for I think he should spend more time with his children. And once with that set up, we can now analyze what are the components that go into the word should. Well, there are 4 of them. First, and now with these 2 parties, by the way, like I think that she should lock the door. We've now got an antagonist and an agonist. The she is the agonist. The I is the antagonist. It's my opinions and my belief system and everything that is going to, either in fact or in principle, going to exert some kind of pressure on her behavior. That's the nature of the force dynamic direction. Well, the first component of the use of should is, first of all, the observation that she, in fact, does not close her door when she leaves. So first of all, there's the negative behavior, that the actual behavior is negative to what the sentence itself says. If I say she should X, or she should VP, it means she does not VP. The second thing means, in my belief system, it would be beneficial to her if she in fact VP, if she in fact closed the door when she, locked the door when she. The third component is, in my value system, values meaning what I consider better and worse. In my value system, she would be a better person if she locked the door when she leaves. So there's one is what would be beneficial to her in my belief system. The other is she would be like a morally better person in my value system. Okay, now if we only had those 3, it wouldn't be enough to capture the force dynamic quality of should. Because if you had only those 3, you could in fact paraphrase those 3 by saying something like, I think she would be a better person and would be benefited by locking the door when she leaves. But that's a rather cold, neutral statement. It doesn't have any of the pushy power that should does. So where does this pushy power come from? It's that we need one crucial 4th component, which is in fact the force dynamic component, which is I want her to lock the door when she leaves. So it's now all of a sudden we have a confrontation of wants. Her desire, she doesn't want to lock it. My desire, I want her to lock it. Now we've got a conflict. It's the origin of the pushy part. Why should has a kind of force dynamic push to it. Okay, so now, in effect, we've sort of characterized what should means. But there's a fascinating issue that arises. What happens if the person that I'm symbolizing as Y, the holder of the views, who if those views are not known by X, the person performing the behaviors. Now, in some cases, they do the X person, the person performing the behaviors, does know my beliefs or Y's beliefs. For example, if I say, you should close the door, lock the door when you leave, now you've heard me express my opinion. So you, the agonist, are the arena for a certain force dynamic opposition. Within your psyche, now, there could be a conflict between your desire not to lock it and what you've now heard from me, my desire that you lock it. So your mind is now the arena. Similarly, since I just earlier covered the divided self, we can have a divided self with a should statement. You can say, I really should lock the door when I leave. That means, I think I should lock the door when I leave. And following our divided self analysis, that means the first I is the more external I, the evaluative self, and the second I is the more central one that has the id-like desire, in this case, not to lock the door. So in this case, again, both parties know each other's feelings about the matter. I communicate with myself sufficiently so that I know that I want myself to lock the door. So then there remains the curious case where, in fact, the performer doesn't know of the speakers, as in, she should lock the door when she leaves. She, therefore, she just blithely leaves the door open and is unaware that there's any force dynamic problem. Her psyche is free of a force dynamic problem. Mine, though, has it. I'm the one, the speaker, who wants her to lock the door, and I am frustrated by watching her not lock the door time after time. So the force dynamic conflict occurs in my psyche. Now, there's another case where that happens, and it's just another portion of force dynamic logic, how it works. The other case is shows up in the last two sentences of this presentation. If you say, what, John finally agreed. Well, John, contrasted with the lizard, finally moved. Okay, now John finally agreed means John was aware, this is part of the urging example, the interpersonal example. John didn't want to agree. I kept pressuring him. The pressure built and built and built, and finally in this three-phase cartoon, the balance of power shifted, he became weaker, and he finally agreed. We're going to be using the word finally. So his psyche was the arena for this conflict to work itself out. He didn't want to leave, or to agree, and he was pressured, he experienced pressure, it increased. Finally, it forced him to change his mind. Well, what about the lizard? The lizard finally moved. Well, the lizard is blithely, happily unaware that anybody watching him wants him to move. The lizard is not conflicted internally. It has no psychological trauma. It moves when it feels like it. So where is the conflict? The conflict is in the speaker. The speaker wants the lizard to move. The lizard's standing there stationary causes increased frustration in the speaker, a buildup of frustration, which is finally released when, in fact, he sees the lizard move. So the arena of the force dynamic action takes place within within the subject in this case, within the antagonist. So it's parallel to the case with the shoulds. What I've done here is proposed a fundamental conceptual structuring system. One of the first four major schematic systems that we use to conceptualize, to structure conceptual material. And we find these four. I dealt with the first two of them anyway in this morning's talk. We find these conceptual structuring systems highly represented in language through its closed class forms in particular, although they also show up in closed class forms. And we found this one highly represented in language forms. There were both closed class forms and open class forms in this case. So it's the whole point of this approach may start to get clear for you. It's to identify, to discern, to determine how language, as a system, as a cognitive system, is built so that how it structures conception, how it structures conceptual material. And the method for doing it is to read the patterns off of language itself. Not to impose anything on language from the outside, from some conceit you have, but rather to discern the patterns that language itself has for how it groups concepts together, runs skeins of particular conceptual distinctions through material, and so forth. And if you follow them out and then organize all those findings, and you find these, at least four, I know of several others, major schematic systems that, in fact, prove to be the major schematic systems for how language structures concepts. And many of the subsequent talks will elaborate on that further. It's enough for today.